everyone, this is Derek Plavin. Welcome back to episode 42 of How to Practice Jazz Guitar Efficiently. Now, if this is the first video you've ever seen on this channel, I would really recommend that you go back to episode 1 and try to watch the videos in order as best as you can. I know that they're long, but if you want to benefit the most from this channel, that's what I would do, because this is like a free online jazz guitar course that unfolds in a logical sort of manner. But since you did click on this video today, maybe check it out first and see if you like it, and then you can take it from there. Alright, so before I begin, I just want to make a couple of quick evening announcements. So first of all, the channel has officially reached 100 subscribers, and while that may not really actually be a lot, and this channel is still relatively new and small and hopefully continuously growing, but it still really means a lot to me, and I just want to say thank you to everyone who has subscribed so far, and I'm just thrilled that there's people that are enjoying the content. And if you're also watching and you haven't subscribed yet and you're digging what I'm doing, do me a favor and subscribe as well. And then next, I just want to give a shout out to one of the subscribers. I'm just going to put their name up because I don't want to butcher the pronunciation, but they made a comment letting me know that the audio on my vocals was panned to one side, and I didn't even know that because you really notice it in the headphones. So maybe other people were noticing that issue as well, and I finally learned what the issue was and how to fix it, because I'm just stupid and lazy with this stuff. So easy fix. And now it's all good. No one should have any issues with that anymore, so that's another good thing. And other than that, this video today, if you notice the caption in the thumbnail, some people may have seen this comment before or be familiar with it, and others may not, but I would say the main idea that this video is kind of related to has to do with that. And if anything, I would say that in a way, the stuff I talk about is kind of like my own personal perspective on that whole idea. So this is the main topic of the video, but I'm not really going to get into this idea in a sense until at least 15-20 minutes into the video, just so you're aware. And I go over some other stuff in the beginning to review, but know that it's coming. And like I said, I find this to be a really interesting topic, so maybe some of you have thought about this stuff before or have your own ideas, and let me know in the comments what you think, alright? Because I'm definitely interested to know what other people think as well. So that's it, and I hope you enjoy. Now, today I want to continue discussing the topic of simplifying the harmony when we're soloing, and for the example, I wanted to look at the changes for the standard T for 2 by Vincent Youmans, because I thought it would be a good example to demonstrate the main ideas that I want to talk about today. We're still going to look at the whole tune today, and some of the things I'll point out that pertain to certain parts I've already discussed in other videos on this topic, and they'll be a good reinforcement of those ideas. But a fair amount of this tune, I think, can be a really good application for the new ideas that I want to discuss in this video today. So I want to get right into it, but before I put the changes up, I just want to mention that although this tune is commonly played in the key of A flat major, I did some research on this tune, and it originally comes from the Broadway play No No Nanette, which was based off of a book, and in that play, it really was done in the key of A flat major.
Picture you upon my knee.
Just T for 2 and 2 for T.
But in the movie from 1950 entitled T for 2, which was based off of this play, they play the tune mostly in the key of E flat major.
Picture you upon my knee, just T for 2 and 2 for T.
And there's a part where they also do it in D flat major as well.
Picture me upon your knee with T for 2 and 2 for T.
As we've seen with the last few videos, there's often several ways that the harmony of a particular tune could be interpreted that are related. And if you listen to the Broadway version that was originally in A flat, it's actually pretty simple and void of even some of the common motions that we understand with this tune today. And when you listen to this tune the way it was played in the movie, you'll start to hear some of the additional harmonic motions that are more reminiscent of the things that we do now. So because of this, I figured we could look at the chord changes for this tune today in the key of E flat major, just to be different and to possibly reinforce your harmonic transposition skills by taking a song that you may be familiar with in another key and looking at it in a new key so you can really understand the common chord progressions regardless of what key you're in. And in addition to this, we've looked at a few examples already in the last couple of videos that were also in the key of E flat major, so you'll see them as kind of similar and it'll just give you more reinforcement again. Now, as usual, I didn't write these chord changes out myself, but that's okay, it just gives us more stuff to talk about, and I'll let you know which parts I really don't agree with for the most part in terms of how they're primarily written out here. So, first, I want to quickly go through the parts that are a review of some of the things I've already discussed, so I may be jumping around the form a little bit more, but as you'll see, there really aren't a lot of unique chord progressions or harmonic movements in this tune, so there isn't really a lot to cover. So, if we take a look at it, we'll see that the form shows to be an A-B-A-C form, and I would agree with that, and each section is 8 bars, so it's a 32 bar form, and the A sections are pretty similar with the harmony. The only difference really is in the last 2 bars, which is pretty common, and even the B section, even though it's a B section, those changes are also pretty much the same type of changes that are happening up until the last 2 bars, and it's just in a different key. So if we can understand what's going on in the first section, or the A section, we can understand the B section as well, in terms of how we approach it harmonically. So the C section is really the most different. So the first thing that I want to remind you of, which is actually in a good amount of this tune, would be in the A section in bars 1 and 2 and 5 and 6, and we have 2 A sections, and like I said, the B section is similar also, just in a different key. So the same thing would apply to bars 1 and 2 and 5 and 6 for the B section. So as you'll notice, we basically have just consecutive 2 5s in whatever key it is, either in the key of E flat major or the key of G major in the B section. So, like I've said before, the simple way, is at least a foundation to approach it, would be to think of it more as if it was just 1 2 5. Like if you had, a whole measure of F minor or a whole measure of B flat 7. You don't have to, think that you have to go back to the F minor in the next bar in any sort of way. You can, but like I always say, the thing to keep in mind is the integrity of the phrase, and you don't want to create a sense of whatever you're doing being interrupted just to hit the right harmony, alright? And of course, like I say, this is all diatonic to the key of E flat major, but, you could think like just diatonic to E flat, but I may, for this situation, which I'll talk again in a little bit about, approach it more as if you were thinking F minor or just that 2 5s. So, if the harmony is going, just play a 2 5 or something that works over the whole thing. Resolving. Don't interrupt the phrase, alright? Simplify your thinking. And I may have said this in one of the other parts of this topic, but if the harmonic instrument or the comper is playing that, they're suggesting that motion anyway, and they're able to take care of it by doing that. So musically, you're all creating, a combined sound anyway. So you don't have to think that you always have to articulate all those changes going back and forth with 2 5s. All right. So that would be the first thing, and also, like I said, the B section would be the same thing, just in the key of G major, and then we do it again in the second A section. All right. Now, the next thing that I want to say before we move on would be if we look at the C section now, all right? Now, the first 4 bars, which is really what I'm talking about here, it can be written out different ways, but basically what you have is you just have essentially a minor tonality turning around on itself. 1, 5, 1, and that could be expressed in a lot of ways. It could be 1, then the diminished that relates to it, and then 1, which is kind of what's shown here. And you can think of it basically like playing around with a Barry Harris minor 6 diminished scale or something like that, and using that and considering the melody. So you can consider things like that. Now, regardless of what I'm going to tell you in a second, the point that I want to bring up here is, even though you have all these changes, when you have a progression like this, which is pretty much a minor tonality turning around on itself consistently in some sort of way, even if it was just a minor 1, 6, 2, 5, you can just think the minor tonality. And you can approach it Dorian, you can also approach it Aeolian-ish, but if you're going to approach it Aeolian or Dorian, be careful on certain chords. And it's really pretty much in the land of F minor until you get to the D flat 7 chord in the 4th bar there. So you just need to simplify your thinking down to F minor. And one thing that I would bring up, and I kind of got this from one of the versions from the movie.
We will raise a family, a boy for you, a little girl for me.
The way I would look at this harmony, I would look at this mostly correct. I would say the first one would be, F minor 7, then G diminished 7. And to remind you, that's the 2 diminished, the way I see it. And functionally speaking, the 2 diminished is basically like a 5 chord. And you can see it's basically like a C7 with the 5th in the bass, which is the 5 of F minor, right? So after that, we have that, like I said, F minor 6, G diminished. Now it shows A flat major. I like to just go back to the F minor, which is the relative minor. It's the same tonality anyway, in that sort of F minor tonic tonality. So it goes there, and then it goes back to the G diminished there. I may play it like this because that's more of like the melody, because I'm playing these voicings that are considering the melody, right? And then after that, now here I would think it's a little different. So that F minor 7 and then F minor 7 over E flat, I think it's more of like a 5 sound or a 2 diminished, like I just said. So G diminished again, going then to resolve to the F minor. Now the bass motion was kind of unclear in some of the recordings I was listening to, but it's basically like you have a G diminished in the end of bar 2 there, but then it kind of continues with a different voicing and then resolves again to F minor. Now, the D flat 7, which is basically like the backdoor 2-5, like the flat 7-7, and that goes along with, an A flat minor. If you wanted to play that, that would be cool. But in the version I was listening to, they actually use the tritone. It sounds great. They play like a straight up, G7 with the regular 5th and everything. Actually, did they play the 5th? No, just root 3rd and 7th with the octave doubled up. And then from there, they basically just play the diminished that's related to that, so you can think G sharp diminished with the G in the bass. And that is basically coming from the melody. It sounds really good with that. So that whole part would be like... something like that, right? And until you get to that last bar, I would just think F minor, for the most part. And you can always express the 5 too, but keep it simple to start. So other than that, the last 4 bars of this C section is essentially like a 3-6-2-5, but that, that diminished is sort of a substitution for the 6th chord. It's not the same diminished. And we might talk about that a little bit at the end, but this is just, a common diatonic progression. But we'll maybe talk about it more at the end, because now I want to get into some of the unique points that I want to make today with what we have left with this tune. Alright, so the main thing that I want to talk about today is essentially a harmonic concept that you can use as one kind of an approach to actually articulating all of the chord changes that you may find in a given scenario. You can use this idea with any chord progression that you want, and I will be discussing the entire tune today through the perspective of this kind of approach. But the way that I see it, there oftentimes seems to be certain examples of chord progressions or the context in which they may be existing in within the given form that, for whatever reason, seem to lend themselves pretty naturally to doing this kind of a thing if you choose to do so. So the basic idea is actually pretty simple. All it is that when you're considering the harmony of whatever notes you may be playing, whether that's a melodic phrase like a linear type of thing or a chordal idea, as you move from chord to chord, you really want to try and label all of the harmonies in a way that would suggest as little harmonic motion or change happening from whatever chord was happening right before it as possible. And you want to continue doing that as you keep on moving from chord to chord. So now you're on this new chord, and when you go to the next chord, you want to consider what you're beginning with on this new chord. Now, that may have seemed like a mouthful, but just to give you a quick example to show you what I mean, we can look at, the very first chord change that happens in the tune with the 2-5 in the key of E flat. We have the F minor and the B flat 7, right? So a clear example of what I'm talking about would be for the F minor, maybe we'll just think F minor triad. We can think F minor 7 arpeggio, but let's just start with the triad. And then when we go to B flat 7, we want to think of it as F diminished triad, okay? And the reason why is because that diminished, which is the same thing as B diminished, which you may more clearly see is related to B flat 7, that diminished is related to that, like I just said. And from a functional point of view, like I've said in other videos, I see that diminished mainly as the 2 diminished. And I've said that the 2 diminished, functionally speaking, basically acts like a 5 chord in that key, all right? So when you look at it like this, there appears to be not a lot of motion because we're staying on some sort of 2 either way. So the ideas that may inevitably come out may be easier to kind of visualize on the fretboard because all you're doing is really lowering one note, if that makes sense. And if we did play, the whole minor 7 arpeggio, we can go to the diminished 7th arpeggio after. It's the same basic thing happening. We're just lowering 2 notes a half step instead of 1, and the other 2 are staying consistent. All right? So from a voice leading perspective, this is really good. And just to give you some other examples of pretty much the same movement that are happening in the same example, instead of thinking of it like F minor to start with, let's say we started with the relative major, like A flat major. Well, the diminished that would relate to the F diminished is also A flat diminished, also the 4 diminished. So the same basic kind of thing is happening here. For a 2-5, instead of thinking 2-5, we could think the 4 chord in the key, 4 major, and then 4 diminished. Right? So same type of thing happening. And then what if for the F minor, instead of thinking of F minor, I've said this in other videos, we think of the C minor triad, which would give you like a F minor 11 type of sound. Well, in this case, we don't have the same diminished, so it doesn't go C minor to C diminished, but we still, again, want to look at it in a way where there isn't a lot of motion. So we can move it down a half step to B diminished, and that's still not a lot of change. So from that, we can create a line that would go maybe something like this, like a 2-5-1, like, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Something like that. And we're still only using a little bit of motion or change. Now, this fragment of the chord progression here is not the particular fragment that I wanted to use that I thought would be a good application for this and the reason why I picked this tune, but before I continue, I just want to point something out. Now, if you've checked out a lot of different resources for jazz education and whatnot, especially if you've looked at some of the Barry Harris stuff, you may have come across this quote that Barry, I guess, popularized when he said it, and he said that Coleman Hawkins said this to him, and what I'm talking about is when he said, apparently, that Coleman Hawkins said, "I don't play chords, I play movements." Now, here's the thing. I'm not going to try and say that the main idea I'm talking about today is exactly what Coleman Hawkins meant when he said this, and I don't even know if Barry Harris's interpretation of that statement is exactly what Coleman Hawkins was thinking of. Because if you check out some of the Barry Harris stuff, if you can find it like related to this type of idea, it's pretty interesting and it's all valid stuff. But he talks a lot about actual chord playing and voicings, and Coleman Hawkins played the saxophone, obviously, and anything that he plays, even if he's thinking harmonically, you know, as he goes from one note to the other, there's always, you know, emotion that's happening. And with the Barry Harris way of looking at it, he kind of talks about it from a perspective of creating motion when you're staying on a chord or one tonality. So I don't even know if their interpretations of this line up. And like I said, it doesn't even matter. This is almost my interpretation of that statement, and that's how I kind of see this concept that I'm teaching you today. So basically, if you look at the example that I showed you already, because there isn't a lot of motion or movement when you go like F minor triad to F diminished, you know, two notes are staying the same and one is moving, only a half step. So from a voice leading perspective, that's very good. And also with this particular example, and with a lot of examples as you'll see, because you're thinking about it in your head with a label where the root note of the harmony isn't changing, there's something about that again, I think makes it easier to approach when you're visualizing your ideas, your phrases that you may want to play, so that it seems simpler or more clear in what you have to do. Okay, so the chord progression in this song that I think this concept actually works really well with is what we find in bars 3 and 4 of the A section, and I'll point out for the sake of simplicity, just like we had with those repetitive 2/5s before, we find the same basic progression throughout this tune, so it takes care of a lot of the form. So it's exactly the same in the same key in the second A section, obviously, in bars 3 and 4 again, and also like we have with the B section, in bars 3 and 4, it's the same chord progression from a functional point of view, which is really what we're trying to understand and talk about today, but just in the key of G major instead of E flat major, so we don't have to discuss that, alright? It all boils down to the same progression. So first, I'll say that if we look at the chords the way they're written on this chart, in my opinion, you know, in terms of, you know, what is commonly accepted and the way people will play it at a jam session and what we think of as correct, I would say that the first 3 chords are good, and the last one, although it's not totally a wrong chord, the way it's functioning, I don't think that's what it should be. I think it should be more of a flat 3 diminished sound or a tonic diminished sound, the way I really see it instead. It's tricky because understand that the way they're functioning is the same. They're doing the same job in a musically logical way, but they're coming from different sounds, because that C7, which is like the 6/7 in that key, if we turned it into the diminished, you know, instead of C7 you would have D flat diminished, and that's the same diminished as E natural diminished, which is the way I see it, the flat 2 diminished, and we always see that as a substitution in a 1-6-2-5, the 1, the flat 2 diminished, you know, so that's really the diminished sound of what's associated with the C7, but that's not the same one. We're looking at the tonic diminished, which again I see more as a 4/7 sound, which could take you anywhere. It could take you to the 1, it could take you to the 5, it can take you to the 4 in a sort of way that it's resolving to the same tonal center. Alright, so it's very versatile. And if you look at the way some people have kind of played the harmony in these historical contexts, you can learn from that too. So I think that the general progression should be flat 3 diminished there, so that would be a F sharp diminished 7, but just to kind of talk about that a little bit and to show you how things may have evolved to this sort of common chord progression, the original Broadway version, I'm pretty sure like those whole 2 bars after the 2/5 and they land on the E flat tonic, they just kind of stay there.
Picture you upon my knee.
Just T for 2 and 2 for T.
You know, kind of like, you know, they may just like go back and forth between the major 7 and minor 7. That's one thing I'm going to point out next. And that's a common sort of thing to do when you're creating motion on a major chord and you're sitting there. You go from the major 7 sound and then the more stable major 6 sound, the same tonic. So that's really like the simplest version, because then it would be going back to the F minor, right? And if we look at it like that, that's a good place to point out that, like I always say, everything is all about context, because we should recognize this progression as a diatonic cycle progression inserted into form, like I've talked about in the other parts, but because of this context, and if you're playing this medium tempo, because this song originally was more of a medium thing, but people play this more up a lot too, but if you're playing it slower, you may want to articulate every change, because in this song, you start at the 2 chord in the beginning, the 2 minor, which is associated with the subdominant tonal center, and you stay there, and that's really established by repeating the 2-5 in the second measure. So there really is like a change or something that you want to imply when you finally resolve to the tonic in bar 3. So even though it's all diatonic to E flat major, you may not want to think like that. You may still want to be thinking about like F minor or like a 2-5 line or something in those first 2 bars. All right, so because of that context, and then we land on the tonic, but we don't turn around onto it again. We're actually landing in a logical place in bar 5 again on the 2 minor chord. So because of that context, you're kind of creating this direction, and you may want to create more interest in between the 2 F minor chords in those 2 bars. So not that it needs a justification, but that's like the subjective context to me as to why you may want to approach it in a way where you're articulating this change in harmony, all right? So before I get to looking at it the way I think it should be in a standard form with just all those chords except a flat 3 diminished at the end, I'll just want to show you one way that they kind of did it that was cool, that would be like a next evolution of that. So when they came out of those 2 5s in one of the parts in the movie, they did this thing where they first played something like, it looks like a E flat major 9 over B flat. It just has the 5th in the bass, which is all good, but it also, like those 3 notes on top, could also be perceived as like a G minor 7 chord without the 3rd. All right, and then from there they keep the 5th in the bass, and then they play this, which is more of like a E flat 6 over the 5 or the B flat. So that's also again showing that motion that I was just talking about, the major 7 sound to the minor major 6 sound to create motion on a major chord. All right, and it's keeping the 5th in the bass, which is interesting. And that major 6 sound, if you look at those notes, that's just a C minor triad. So if you looked at this as more of like a simplistic triadic sort of thing, you could think like G minor triad to C minor triad over like a E flat tonic sound, something like, so that's also kind of related to this whole like play movements, not chords type of thing. All right, so it does that. And then after that, in the next measure, like I said, in the original, they may just stay on the tonic. The G minor 7 is like a tonic. It's the 3 chord, so it is kind of staying there. But he plays this thing, which is basically a E flat major 7 chord without the 3rd again, and then an E flat diminished. So that's also showing why it's more of the tonic diminished sound versus the flat 2 diminished sound to take you to the F minor in the next bar, in my opinion. All right, so that's a cool kind of way to kind of articulate the harmony here, basically coming out of the 2-5. Basically what it is right? And it sounds great. So if I was going to apply the concept now, and again, I'm going to go back to just the conventional changes here, the E flat major 7, I would just play an E flat major triad on to kind of do it in a similar way where I'm thinking in these triadic ways. And with the triads, you may say that it's easier to create these little movements because you're only using 3 notes instead of maybe more notes in a particular harmony, so it's easier to keep things simple. 2 notes would be even more simple. So for the E flat major 7, I would play an E flat major triad, and then for the A flat 7, which is like your 4-7, you would do something similar to what you may have already known in a blues. So if we thought of that A flat 7 chord like a 5 chord, since it's a dominant, the 2 of that 5 is E flat minor 7. So we can just turn that into an E flat minor triad. So already, when we go to that 4-7 chord, all we have to do is lower the 3rd, E flat major to E flat minor. And then in the next bar, the G minor 7, like I just said, is a tonic sound. It's still E flat major. So all you have to do is come back up to E flat major. And then if we think flat 3 diminished, or again, tonic diminished, that's E flat diminished. So again, another E flat chord, right? And if you're just kind of creating lines over that, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you would just land right back on it, right? So, like I said before, when you think in this kind of way, it can be easier sometimes to clearly visualize these types of phrases that you could work out with smooth voice leading, because you're kind of thinking of all the harmonies as having the same root note, and you're just altering a couple notes so that you can sort of create a sense of harmony that is changing, even if it has the same root note. Now, like I said, I really think it should be a tonic diminished for that last chord there, but since the C7, which would be like the flat 2 diminished, has the same function, that is another choice. It's a different sound, but from the point of view of this concept, if we play E flat major to E flat minor, then E flat major again, then if we go with a flat 2, the flat 2 diminished from the point of view of this thing is still very smooth and minimal motion and good voice leading, because all you're doing is raising the root note to the flat 2 and you have the flat 2 diminished. Everything else stays the same, so that works as well. Okay, so that's basically a way that you can approach this particular chord progression within this song, and maybe you can see why I think that this is a good example of where to use that type of thing. And if anyone has thought similar things or whatever, let me know in the comments. So if I were to go through the rest of the tune and kind of talk about things in this perspective, I already talked about the F minor to B flat 7 and, to the diminished. Now, if you're coming into that from E, going then to E major, I mean, that's still pretty easy, because a lot of times, even though you're moving to another triad instead of keeping the same root, you're just moving either down a whole step to the next root or a half step sometimes, like we saw before. So still not a lot of motion. So check this out. Coming out of this main chord progression, if I play E flat major, and then I play minor, and then I play major again, and then I play diminished, now we're going to the F minor again. So what else is F minor if I want to create minimal motion? Well, that's like the 2 chord. So something that's related is D flat diminished, because that's the 7 chord in that key, and that's the common relationship that we've seen before, the half diminished instead of a minor 6 sound for the 2 sound. So coming out of an E flat diminished, you can play D diminished, and that works for the 2, and it also works with the 5, the B flat 7. So you can just stay on that, and check this out. Then you would resolve into the tonic in the last 2 bars and just stay there and go from that D diminished to that E or tonic major. And even though that's a pretty simple progression, it actually sounds really sophisticated and good to just have like a basic E flat, like a tonic diminished going down to the 7 diminished, and then tonic major, right? And it sounds great because it's coming out of this logical sort of place. All right, now when you go to the A minor in the B section, that is a significant change because you're modulating, and this is going to be approached pretty much identical. There's nothing different here. The only difference is when you get to the last 2 bars, instead of staying on that G major tonic for 2 bars, you're just going to go to B flat 7, which you're going to imply the change of the modulation back to the original key, right? So then we get to the second A section, and it's going to be all similar until we get to the last 2 bars. So you can think of that as a change, and you can really play the same thing, because in the melody, they're kind of coming out of this, and then they go to, they have the flat 3 of the half diminished in the melody there, and then it stays there. And that's just your flat 2 diminished in that key to take you to the F minor, like I said before. And it actually sounds really good if you play just an inversion of a regular C7 chord. So basically that 2-5 would sound like 2, right? Simple stock voicings that sound good. So that's basically like a minor 2-5, and I've talked about a lot of different ways that you can approach that before, and we could think of it like minor 4 if we're in the minor key now of F minor. The 4 minor would be B flat minor. So instead of thinking G half diminished, B flat minor to resolve. All right, now in the first 4 bars of this C section here, we already talked about this. It's just a play between F minor and some sort of dominant or / diminished sound, like tension release, tension release. So there's not a lot to think about. You can basically think, F minor to 2 diminished or 7 diminished, how you see it, right? It's still not a lot of motion, but you can keep it pretty diatonic there, like we said, and then you change when you get to bar 4 there. And then for the last 4 bars, again, we've seen this before. It's just the same variation of a 3-6-2-5. It's just, in this song at least, placed with a different harmonic rhythm than how it's been. So for that progression, if you wanted to use this concept, you can think, you know, E flat major, E flat diminished, D diminished for that whole bar, and then you can think E flat major like I showed before, and then you just turn around in the last bar, okay? So I know that got kind of wordy, but hopefully that can help you guys out, all right? So I'm just going to leave it there today, and if anyone has any questions or anything that they want to say on that, please let me know, and in the next episode,
hope you're ready for the next episode. Hey,
I'm pretty sure that's going to be the last part of this little topic for now, and I'm going to do something that will be a little bit different of a tune than a lot of the stuff we've seen already, so it should be pretty cool. Alright, so if you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it if you gave it a like and consider subscribing, as well as becoming a contributor to Patreon, where you'll get all the PDFs on the channel for $5 a month. And if you think anyone else would enjoy this content, please share it with them as well. And I will see you guys in episode 43.
Swinging and playing the blues. That's what we about.
I try to help you.